It's my thyroid. I've put on weight. I've gone all hot, etc. But maybe it's not your thyroid. Okay. But maybe the lack of thyroid hormone building blocks or the things that help to make it. So I'm going to explain this in a little bit detail, but hopefully at the end of it, you will become an expert in what actually happens in the thyroid. Okay. So for those that like a little bit of a geek out, this is called histology. So it's the microscopic counterpart to gross anatomy. So when you talk about big things, that's gross anatomy. So anyway, in the thyroid, the functional cells of the thyroid, they're called follicular cells. And when you see a picture of a cell, you know, an illustration, it's like this. But remember, it's 3D. Okay, so you've got this follicular cell. There's lots of them in the thyroid. And inside package is a thing colloid, okay? And that's where thyroid hormone is going to be produced. And this is where the things that you've heard associated with thyroid will make some sense. So iodine, okay, that's the first thing. What actually happens? Well, you have this pool of colloid, and what's going to happen is that iodine is going to go into there. But let's just give you a little bit of basics. So you can get iodine from eggs, dairy, and seafood. So that's where carnivore really helps. That's the first thing. So if you've been on a vegan diet, or if you've been calorie restricting or low fat, which we'll also talk about, that's why you might be having problems with your thyroid, because of these building blocks. But if you're eating eggs, dairy, and seafood, one of the big building blocks is iodine. So that's really interesting to think about. The thyroid maintains a pool of iodine. Once you start to eat it, about 8,000 micrograms are stored, but it's stored as iodide. We'll talk about that as well. So here we go then. Right. So what actually happens is you've got this ingestion of iodine, and it goes into your body, and the body changes it to a thing called iodide. Okay. And it is in your bloodstream. And these follicular cells, there's blood vessels around there. And as the iodide goes past, it's taken up and it goes into the center of all these little follicular cells. And that take up is really interesting, because you've got a transporter, or importer it's actually called, which is actually sucking in sodium, but it also sucks in iodide. So there's one of the things you might not have enough of: sodium. See, salt, simple as that. Because this importer will only work because it will only allow iodide into the lumen, the center bit, if you have enough salt in your system. All right, so that's the first thing. This the importer needs to work. So if you've been avoiding salt, maybe it's time to try it. Okay, so the next thing, so what happens then? Right, so you've got these follicular cells. And by the way, they are capable of storing up to 50 days worth of iodide and thyroid hormone. It goes into here and it has to be oxidized. Now, that's a posh way of saying a chemical process, basically, where the atoms lose electrons. But the reason I'm telling you that is because we need to know the chemistry to understand why, when we get blood tests, what that actually means. So there's a thing called hydrogen peroxide, and that actually is the thing that takes the electrons off. And then you've got inside here, you've got a thing called thyroid globulin. Now, when you get your bloods, and people really know about this if they've had thyroid issues, you get a thing called TG antibodies. And that's because the thyroid globulin that's in here, that has to bind with the iodine, or the iodide as it is now. And that's one of the things that can be attacked, that thyroid globulin, and then we call it TG antibodies. Okay, so that's one thing that we need to be aware of. So then what happens, there is an enzyme called peroxidase, thyroid peroxidase, and that actually pushes together the thyroid globulin and the iodide. And that is TPO, thyroid peroxidase is TPO, and that's the other antibody that we look for. So there are enzymes inside that are doing these things, and there's globulins that are inside, and they can be attacked by the autoimmune reaction, so to speak. And what happens, the thyroid globulin will make one of two things. It will make a monoiodine, which is known as MIT, or it'll make it's actually called tyrosine, actually, two iodines, and that's called DIT. Two of those then go together, which has got two iodines, they both got it, and that's T4. And sometimes the MIT and the DIT will mix together, and that's T3. There you go. Simple as that. So when you combine these things, you've got these things in your system now. So T4 is made, about 80% of what is produced by the thyroid or the follicular cells that eventually gets pumped out by the thyroid is T4, and the rest is going to be T3. And then what happens in the system is that T4 is circulating, that gets converted to T3 in the peripheral tissue. Okay. But that is the next thing we need to know about, because there's one other thing I always recommend on blood tests, and that's selenium. So once it's in your system, T4 has an enzyme called deiodinase. Enzyme basically takes the T4, takes off an iodine, and this protein then is made T3. And that has a molecule at the center of this enzyme called selenium. So when you're eating an animal-rich, animal protein, animal fat diet, you get plenty of selenium. But that's why I suggest, if you're having problems with your thyroid, to get your selenium levels checked. So now we know that the thyroid, to make thyroid hormone, needs iodine, it needs selenium, it needs some sodium for the transporter. And there's also another thing we didn't just mention, but it's always worth talking about: zinc. Zinc is pretty good as well. So you could always get your zinc levels measured, because zinc helps move nutrients into cells. So that's that. So I'm going to actually just tell you one last thing. So I remember I said that 80% of the thyroid is pumping out T4 and the rest is T3, and then it gets converted. Well, actually, all this stuff is moving around, and it's bound to proteins to move it. It doesn't float around freely, except for about 1% of that. And that's when you get the reading free T3 or free T4. And that's actually the only time it's really essential and effective, when it's free. When it's bound to proteins, it can't really do anything. So we also need to look at the levels of thyroxine binding proteins, or thyroid binding proteins. TBP is a thing you can look at, and that can tell you how much is floating around and your body isn't able to get, because it's bound up with proteins. So the reason I'm telling you that is because the blood tests we can then interpret and understand. When you get a blood panel for thyroid, you've got TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone, T4, T3, free T4, free T3, and then you've got TG and TPO antibodies. And it's really interesting, once you understand this process of making thyroid hormone, how simple actually understanding the blood panel can become. That's in an abundance in eggs. That's also in pretty much all meat. So I think most animal products you'll be fine with. Zinc in particular, most people think of oysters. So that's true. Zinc is one of those things that are rich in oysters, and it can actually help your libido and stuff like that. But that's why I was smiling, because most people think oysters are an aphrodisiac, and it does seem to be true, because zinc has a correlation with libido. So I think if you're just firstly avoiding all the plant materials and avoiding all the things that are anti-inflammatory, but make sure you've got enough selenium, make sure you've got enough zinc, make sure that you've got enough iodine, and then you can get that from fish, eggs, and seafood. So